All right, this is Rudy. It's October the 24th, the year 2016. I'm in the process of reading Not Guilty, the Unlawful Prosecution of United States Senator Ted Stevens. This is some powerful stuff that all of America needs to know. You have to, I'm trying to think of the best way to do this. I'll tell you what. you got to have developed your own perspective and your own lens of how to view Brenda Morris. Brenda Morris works very closely with a man by the name of Joseph Bottini, and you have had to have developed your own perspective about the longest United States Republican serving senator in U.S. history, Senator Ted Stevens. World War II veteran, 84 years old at the time. I'm going to read to you these pages without much commentary, and you just take it or leave it. I have a very strong and passionate belief about what's going on here, but I'll just read the book, and you can develop your own opinion. Page 186. Keep in mind that Joseph W. Bottini is the same prosecutor that was leading up Schaefer Cox's prosecution. There are only two times in a case when the lawyers are allowed to speak directly to the jury: during opening statements and during closing arguments. And the closing argument is the only time the lawyers are allowed to argue, meaning arguing what the evidence proves, as opposed to describing what the evidence is to the jury. Another way of thinking about it is that opening and closing are when the lawyers get to show how the pieces of the puzzle fit together. In closing arguments, the government goes first and last. The government argues first, then the defense argues, and the prosecution responds. That gives the government a tremendous advantage. Studies have shown that the first and last things people hear make the greatest impressions. The government argues twice at the times that matter most. Why? The government is given the advantage of going twice because it bears the burden of proving the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. Because this is considered an advantage for the defense, the government goes twice to make up for it. At least that's the theory. Prosecutor Joseph Bottini gave the government's first closing. He began by arguing Ted Stevens knew that his friend Bill Allen, the accused pedophile, was wealthy. Bill Allen was generous, and he knew that his good friend Bill Allen would help him and give him hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of free benefits. Bottini argued that Senator Stevens received the renovation work for free, all but ignoring the $160,000 that Stevens had paid for $120,000 worth of work. He argued that it just had to be done right. Note was simply a part of a scheme to cover it up. As Bottini told the jury, he's just, pardon my French, covering his ass. Even though Bottini spent much of his argument talking about the sled dog, he admitted, the case isn't about the dog. It's never about the dog. Nonetheless, he then accused the senator of lying about the dog, saying, if he's willing to mislead and cover up about a small ticket item like that dog, what does that tell you what he'd be willing to do when he talks about things like the remodeling of his home? He made a similar point with the massage chair, arguing that his refusal to accept it as a gift was a cover-up, arguing that the fact that the senator had not moved the chair was proof he was lying about it. Of course, Bottini ignored the fact that had the senator moved the chair, he would have been accused of obstruction of justice. The government's theme was clear. Senator Stevens was covering his ass. Bottini used the word cover 14 times during his closing argument. True to government form, he referred to Senator Stevens as the defendant over 80 times, apparently to lump him in with all the other criminals in America. After listening to Bottini's argument, I concluded the government's case was based on fabricated testimony and cynicism. If only we could prove the testimony was fabricated, we could negate the cynicism. Unlike Bottini, who had paraphrased what had been said by the witnesses in closing arguments, Brenda, who is arguing for the defense, by the way, so he was arguing for Senator Ted Stevens, likes to quote from transcripts. He likes to read the actual testimony. The government had apparently read our arguments from prior trials, because they filed a motion for an order that Brendan could not read from transcripts during closing arguments. They argued that reading from actual transcripts would confuse the jury and make closing arguments longer. Are you kidding me? I thought. Judge Sullivan, of course, denied that motion. Brendan began, "You've heard a very twisted interpretation of the evidence. Not only were you given a twisted interpretation of the evidence, but you've been given a twisted interpretation of the real life, the way the Stevensons lived at the time, not 7, 6, 8 years later. To believe the government's version of the evidence, you've got to think Senator Stevens is some kind of mastermind of a conspiracy who goes through life, doesn't mean what he says in the documents, writes something so it will protect him 7 or 8 years later out there somewhere. You see, the problem is, if you look at life through filthy, dirty glass, we've all seen those places, just dirty glass that doesn't get washed for 5 years or 10 years in some hard-to-get place, then the whole world looks dirty. To believe the government, you have to ignore the written record. The government doesn't want you to understand the evidence here." Brendan then turned to the Torricelli note that it just had to be done right note. This is a letter written on October the 6th, 2002 by Ted Stevens to Bill Allen. "The government wants to make you think this is a cover-up. Just a letter written by a man thinking someday he's got to account for something. You read that letter to yourself and it will take you straight into the mind of Ted Stevens on that day. That shows his intent and shows why he's not guilty. That shows why he didn't do anything willfully or knowingly to violate the law. The government of the United States tries to take that and erase it out, put it off with the false testimony of a witness they brought into this courtroom who got on the stand and said to you, 'Mr. Pearsons told me don't pay any attention to that letter.' That's just Ted covering his ass. An explosion in the courtroom wipes out a letter that was written by a man on October the 6th, 2002. I'm going to prove to you that's an absolute lie that brought this lie into the court." Brendan told the jury that the government never asked Bob Persons about it, and Bob Persons denied ever saying that the senator was just covering his ass. "No, crazy," he said. Brendan pointed out that Allen was protecting his children and protecting his $70 million holdback and trying to minimize his jail time. Keep in mind that Bill Allen was accused of having sex with underage Bambi Tyree, being a pedophile, underage girls, at the Ocean View house, which is exactly what Schaefer Cox was exposing as well. Brendan pointed out that according to most of the witnesses, the senator was hardly ever at the cabin. He took the jury through emails and documents at the time showing that as they lived it, the Stevensons were willing to pay and did pay more than $160,000. He took them through the bills that were paid, every bill presented to the Stevens family totaling over $160,000. He pointed out that Dave Anderson was wrong when he testified that he took down the big tree. In addition, Brendan pointed out that the bills the Stevensons saw only contained general lines for labor, and Rocky Williams signed for supplies 17 times from where Ted and Catherine Stevens sat. It looked like they paid for everything they got as they lived it, looking at the world through clean glass. He paraphrased for the jury the testimony of the appraiser and the assessors, who had valued the renovation at much less, and he took them through the character testimony. After the lunch break, Brendan spoke for another hour, taking the jury through the flaws in the government's case. His final lines were, "The government comes here late in the night of a good man's life, and they try to brand him a criminal. The evidence won't permit it, the law won't permit it, and your gut won't permit it, because you have here a man that has lived 84 years honorably, truthfully, abiding by the law and serving people. They ask you to brand him a criminal, to tarnish everything he has done for 84 years, despite the fact that the evidence is unrefuted that he is an honorable, truthful man." "What?" screamed Brenda Morris, who went next for the government. "Were we at the same trial? Because the evidence I saw was totally different than that imaginative display we just sat through, because the trial I sat through told me that no one is above the law, not a teacher, not a social worker, not a lawyer, and certainly, most certainly, not a sitting United States Senator from the state of Alaska who thinks he is entitled to break the law whenever he thinks it's to his benefit. He believes he was above the law, she argued, asserting that he thinks the law simply didn't apply to him. Thus far, she hadn't talked about any actual evidence. Instead, she had simply appealed to what she had assumed from the beginning was a natural bias against members of Congress. When she did turn to the evidence, she spoke in generalities, not giving specifics other than to say that nobody really seemed to know who was in charge or who worked for whom. She then accused us of throwing Catherine Stevens under the bus. She said that our witnesses were trying to cover the defendant's butt. She even made fun of Ted Stevens for stuttering, which he did from time to time. He was perfectly eloquent when it came to discussing all matters about himself. The words just flowed. As soon as you started asking him about those renovations and how they got paid, rumba, butta, rumba, he started stuttering and sputtering. The prosecutors knew no limits. She accused him of trying to paper the trail. The "it just had to be done right" note was covering his ass. If he could write that note, he could write a check, she argued. The note was just cover. He was trying to paper the trail. She compared the 84-year-old U.S. Senator to a 6-year-old who was cheating while playing hide and seek. I was talking to a friend, and he was telling me this reminds him of his little 6-year-old son, who likes to play hide and go seek. But what he likes to do is he likes to cover his eyes. And then when you say, hey, I see you, he goes, no, I don't see you. I'm not looking, You tell him he's cheating, and then he starts laughing. But she said the defendant is not a 6-year-old, and his actions aren't cute. Then, just moments after comparing the senator to a child, she made fun of his advanced age. You weren't born yesterday, she said, referring to the jurors, and certainly he wasn't the defendant, and certainly he wasn't the defendant, wasn't either. She said that a friend told her, Brenda, maybe since the defendant lived so close to the North Pole, maybe Santa and his elves came down and did this work and completed it. He had been very, very good. She also mocked Catherine Stevens for believing that Rocky Williams and Dave Anderson time was paid through Augie Paon's bills. She closed by once again invoking prejudice against politicians. Interestingly, not once during her final argument to the jury had the prosecutor referred to my client as Senator Stevens or even Mr. Stevens. It was always the defendant, as if being a defendant was tantamount to being guilty, which in the minds of many people it is, unfortunately. But she certainly let the jurors know what he did for a living, at least the way she preferred to phrase it. When you are dealing with politicians, that's a whole different ballgame, because politicians are used to the constant scrutiny of their lives. They carry themselves differently. They talk differently. They're much more guarded, and they talk in a way so as not to expose their vulnerability. The defendant is a powerful politician, she told the jury. He makes a living off his sharp mind and off his influence. Then she asked the jurors to do something that very few people have done. It's to stand up to him, because at the end of the day, behind the growling and that snappy comeback and all that righteous indignation, he's just a man. Make him responsible, ladies and gentlemen, just like any other defendant would be. I wanted to scream right back at her. How dare you call this good man a liar? How dare you call this World War II veteran a criminal? But the rules do not permit talking to the jury at all at that point, much less screaming back at the prosecutor. As I said, the government gets the last word, and at that point, all a defense lawyer can do is hope and pray that that reason and open-mindedness will prevail over bias and testimony that I believe to the core of my being was fabricated. Wouldn't they see that Ted Stevens was not covering his ass? Wouldn't they see that Allen, the accused pedophile, had just made up the covering his ass testimony? Surely the government's tactics would not work. And then I want to jump ahead here. There's stories about how one juror member excused themselves, and the juror member claimed that their dad died, but the juror just left. He just went to go to the horse races in California, and Have you ever heard of that? Like just one of the jurors just skipping town and going to the horse races and not returning? That's what happened with Senator Ted Stevens. Anyway, he goes on to write, the jury entered the room. The courtroom deputy read the verdict form while I stood next to Senator Stevens. Guilty on all counts. The senator's eyes filled with tears. Mine did too. Goes on to write, this is a very important paragraph here. When Ted Stevens was defeated because of an illegal verdict, the balance of power in the Senate shifted. The loss of his seat gave the Democrats a 1-vote margin, a 60-vote majority that could pass any piece of legislation without it being blocked by a Republican filibuster. Having achieved a filibuster-proof majority, the Democratic Senate passed the Obama health care reform legislation on a straight party line vote. The illegal prosecution of Senator Stevens enabled passage of the most controversial legislation of the Obama administration. I take no stand on whether the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, was good legislation or bad legislation. This is Rob Carey, the author, writing this. I do know the legislation was controversial and that many Americans have strong feelings about it. And I know that a piece of legislation so controversial should not have been affected by an indictment that never should have been brought, much less a trial in which prosecutors like Bottini and Brenda Morris cheated over and over again. I want you to imagine Joseph Bottini sitting in that courtroom and with, my goodness, and then he's given a chance to argue and just put out all these lies. He's withheld exculpatory evidence. He's been disciplined for it. You have the defense try to argue on behalf of Senator Ted Stevens, and then you have this young African-American, I'm assuming she's African-American, she looks black in the pictures that I've seen of her, get up and argue against this World War II veteran, against this longest-running senator in United States history. And understand that I don't often stand up for politicians, but you've got this young African-American woman like just blasting him that he's the most corrupt person that she's ever met. They successfully taint the jury to convict him after they've cheated during the trial, and then Obamacare passes because he's convicted. And not only that, but he was the longest running United States senator in United States history, Republican senator, and he loses his reelection. And then we have Obamacare. This is some significant stuff that all of America needs to know about. And
he wasn't convicted, right?
No, they overturned the decision, but it was too late. And then he mysteriously dies in a plane crash later. Right? This is an incredible book, and Satan's webs go very deep, and when you start to see how deep it is and how Satan works, it's pretty deceitful. But we know that we serve a mighty and living God, and all these things that they think they are getting away with, because Brenda Morris is enjoying a great private practice as a lawyer today. She's looked upon with respect. So is Joseph W. Bottini, for that matter. So is Karen Loeffler, right? I don't know how much money Hell's Angel drug runner Gerald Olson got paid, and Bill Fulton's writing a book, right? And Schaefer Cox is in prison. If you guys can't see the big picture, I don't know what to tell you. It's absolutely horrific, but we do serve a mighty and living God, and we'll continue to praise Him until our dying breath.